How's it going, everyone? My name is Casperanza, and today we are going to be talking about the nine sublimes, which is very exciting for me because I don't know, I feel like this is the height of, or at least one of the most important topics in the book that I'm writing, Ontological Bite Marks. If I ever do write the book, I do have a Substack. You can subscribe to me on Substack and watch me write the book. Over time. I'm just releasing blog posts as chapters. So, in my introduction video, you'll actually notice that as I go through all of the different topics, I was circling around the nine sublime types, but I couldn't really pinpoint them or categorize them properly. And I finally have categorized them. I've finally found a categorization system for monsters, and it's based off of the work of Immanuel Kant, because Immanuel Kant discovered two sublimes. He discovered the mathematical sublime and the dynamic sublime, and he wrote about it in the Critique of Pure Judgment. But as I've been studying monsters and trying to categorize monsters, I realized that there's seven other sublimes, and I'm going to talk about those today. If you think about the sublime is a sublimit. You're beneath the limit. You're at the limit of your reason or the limit of your ability to comprehend the world because we are finite creatures. We are creatures with a limited consciousness. Our cognitive maps can only map so much of the world before the map falls and breaks apart. So when we reach the end of our map, that's when a monster arises. The limit is exposed or made vulnerable or is seen with a monstrous face. So we project monsters onto these limits. And different monsters represent different kinds of limits of our knowledge, different terrors on the map. And so this taxonomy that I created with the nine different sublimes, based on the different monsters that you see, you can understand the kind of knowledge that you're limited by and how to navigate that limitation of knowledge. And this is especially important or interesting to me because I used to be an objectivist, right? A rational objectivist. And then I discovered that reason doesn't actually work all the time because reason, when we reach the limits of our map, our reason falls apart. And so that's why I developed this taxonomy. So here are the nine types. There's the mathematical and dynamic, which was discovered by Kant. And then there's the predatory, the uncanny, the temporal, the indifferent, the abject, the systemic and abstract, the transgressive, and then the last type, which is the anti-sublime, which is politics. And other philosophers have already talked about these sublimes, but they never put it into, I mean, it's crazy. Like there's so many different philosophers who have shed light and so much knowledge and understanding of these different sublimes and these sublimits, these limits of reason, but it was never integrated into one system, into one taxonomy. And so that's what this video is about. It's about putting it all together and making sense of it. So the first one is the mathematical. The mathematical marks the edge of your map. Basically, how big can things really go before you can't comprehend things? The terror is insignificant. So the bigger something is, the smaller you feel and the more terrifying it is. So this is so that your imagination is limited by size and quantity. And it's when things are too big to comprehend. Your rational dignity is elevation. So Kant said that when your reason maintains superiority, when your imagination is overwhelmed by size, you achieve spiritual elevation. It's almost like connecting with God. At least that's kind of how I interpret it. Because the great unknown, as I talk about, the great unknown leaks out in all of these different ways. It's fragmented in kind of like these little unknowns. Because the great unknown is God with a face on it. But the nine sublimes mark the different ways that you kind of confront God or the limits of your knowledge. And I like to think of it as the nine Nazgul. Also, I have my trade binder out. If you look, I got my Caius, my nine Caius the Shadow Monarch to represent the nine different types of sublime and their limits. So, um, anyway, some examples of this are the vastness of space, the countless stars in the galaxy, the size of the pyramids, the height of mountains, and the depths of the oceans. And so, some monsters that represent the size are literally just really big monsters. I mean, one way to make something monstrous is to simply make it gigantic. So Godzilla is a really good example of this, and the other monsters that he fights against. And then other examples are monsters that swarm, like locusts or bees in a beehive or rats in a house, where there's just so many you can't comprehend them. That's another example of the mathematical sublime and the terror of insignificance. The next sublime that Kant talks about is the dynamic. And the dynamic is basically sublime that's way too powerful. It marks the fragility of your map. Your just how small. So not only are you small with the insignificant, because the insignificant and the dynamic tend to go hand in hand. It's the reason why Kant talked about them together, and it's also part of the reason why he talked about only these two. But the dynamic is about power and force, the terror is destruction, the philosophers Kant, and same as before, the rational dignity is elevation, but the rational failure is panic, paralysis, and learned helplessness. While for um, mathematical, the rational failure was inferiority, ignorance, and arrogance. Because with the mathematical sublime, um, it's really easy to ignore it because even though you're just a small human, you can pretend like you're not that small at all. So when you come across something really big and you don't respond with spiritual elevation, but you respond with it's much easier to respond with ignorance and arrogance, to act like, oh, the mountain doesn't matter, these innumerable things don't matter. The vastness of space doesn't matter. I'm this really prideful, superior person, right? So that's the rational failure. You're not seeing the limit. You're not respecting the limit of your reason. The dynamic takes it a step further in the sense like you could actually be destroyed. So someone could be in panic and like how powerful the earth is, and the monsters that represent this are again Godzilla, and the different kaiju monsters that Godzilla fights against literally map out, literally mark the limits of different powerful forces. Because Kant talks a lot about nature, and he gives a lot of examples like volcanoes, tornadoes, lightning, storms, ocean waves. Different monsters represent these things. So, like Rodan is a very popular monster that Godzilla fights. Rodan in the movies, the latest movies, he's the monstrous face of a volcano. Um, King Ghidorah, he was mistaken for a hurricane or a storm in the movie, and he breathes lightning. So King Ghidorah is the monstrous face of storms and lightning and even electricity, the power of electricity. Um, and so every single monster is just like a big version made to be really powerful to capture the dynamic forces of nature. And then the third sublime, this is where things get really interesting and we transition away from Kant's sublime to kind of like my sublime. Although, as I said before, many philosophers have already spoken about this. It's just I'm putting it under an umbrella, I'm putting it under a term. And the third sublime I call the predatory sublime. And the predatory sublime marks the map maker and other predators. So, in the sense, you're exposed to your own consciousness and the consciousness of other people. So, you're not looking at how big the mountain is. You're looking at the fact the limits of what you know about other consciousnesses and other people and other predators. So you know how when there's a standoff between two people before they fight, or when a tiger and a prey animal, they're both staring intensely at each other and they're waiting for one of them to move right before they run off or something. That moment when they're both looking at each other, that is the predatory sublime. And the terror is getting eaten alive. Its vulnerability, its desire, its will, it's being seen. And will is really important, right? I mean, another name you could have for this sublime is the will sublime or the agentic sublime. It's this idea that there is a consciousness that is aware of itself that has to take action. And so this is why many of the philosophers for the predatory sublime are existentialists, like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Sartre. Those are like the main ones, but they all deal with this idea. Like Schopenhauer talks about the will. He literally talks about the will. And it's really interesting because Schopenhauer, he he picks up right where Kant left off. And Schopenhauer adds the third sublime without even, I think, really knowing it, but I think he did when he talks about the will, where it's the limit of a person's own consciousness. And and then Nietzsche takes it a step further with the will to power, and then we have Kierkegaard, where there's like this intense anxiety about what do you do with a limited consciousness in this vast and big world. So that's what existentialism is, and Sartre, and again, existentialists in general, like, what do I do with this consciousness? What do I do when I'm awake? So, um, I guess instead of going through this, I'll just read this. When the mind comes across a predator or a human that cannot be comprehended, like a tiger or a snake, the terror evoked is vulnerability and feeling seen. But at the sweet spot where rationality maintains superiority, the consciousness itself is dignified and also dignified with vigilance and strategy. However, if rationality fails, hypervigilance, paranoia, and conspiracy thinking takes hold of the consciousness. But you also feel it when you're the predator pursuing a desired value or a desired creature or object. Either you want to eat it or you want to mate with it or whatever, right? So it's and also there's like this idea that the rational dignity, it is kind of a spiritual elevation in the sense that consciousnesses see each other, they perceive each other, they make, this is where meaning is created. This is where purpose and a sense of like my life matters, because there are other people who witness my mind, my nature, and are acting in response to my nature, to my agency. And on the flip side, I'm an agentic creature responding to their agency. So there's this dynamic of predator and prey and meaning and purpose and navigation and vigilance and paying attention. Um, and so uh, the core of the predatory sublime is just being aware of consciousness itself. You know, being aware of your own consciousness, awakening to your own consciousness, and feeling like that sense of like existentialism, like what do I do with my life, what is the meaning of it, because I'm not just a thing acting in the world, I'm a thing that is aware of the fact that I am a thing acting. And so this, the predatory sublime is really important, and it's the reason why it's like one of the first ones I thought of after asking myself if there are more than two sublimes that Kant talked about. And it's because this is what gives monsters their magic. The predatory sublime is about putting a face and an agency on other objects and creatures and limitations of knowledge. And so like, because as I'm talking about this, right, the sublime. Oh yeah, by the way, I just look at these cute shorts. Like, aren't these? Yeah, and my Lady Gaga shirt. Yeah, really cute. Okay, anyway, back to what I was saying. Um, all of these sublimes that I'm talking about, they just mark the limit of knowledge. But human beings, when they come across a limited, when they can't perceive the unknown, when there's a gap in their knowledge space, when their cognitive map tears, when they see terrors, humans want to put a face on it to fill in the gap, to make sense of it, to give it meaning, to give it purpose and agency. It explains why many Greek gods, or just gods in general, from all of ancient civilization, are basically just faces of Mother Nature, faces of volcanoes, faces of storms, faces of the ocean, like with Poseidon. And even Greek gods, like there's faces of love, because the predatory sublime deals with love and the pursuit of a desired object. So all of these gods are like monstrous faces put on these limits of our understanding of things. And it's what gives monsters their magic. Because without a face, without a monstrous face, how do we navigate these limits of reason? How do we update our maps unless we mark the limits of our maps? We don't want to just um, if there's a really powerful force like a volcano, we want to prepare for that. So we mark that limit on our map with Rodan, with a monstrous face like Rodan, or a volcano god of some type. Until we and this leads me to my next sublime, the uncanny sublime, but you'll notice like the first three sublimes just have to do with nature. It's just the predatory, the dynamic, and the mathematical. But once we get to the uncanny, it's where things start to get a little freaky. It's when things start to get a little unsettling because, in my opinion, this is when the sublime is transmuted or transformed or fragmented or comes with a vengeance. Because once we solve the problems of nature, like volcanoes and storms, and we understand what's happening behind them, and we increase our cognitive awareness and we expand our maps, we suddenly realize that our maps are much more vulnerable to their failures. Because before it wasn't, it was pretty obvious that our maps were small, but we knew our limits. We knew where the danger was. It was very clear. If there's a storm, watch out. If there's a tiger or a snake, watch out. But in the modern world that we live in today, it's not so obvious anymore. We've pretty much solved predators. We've pretty much solved storms and earthquakes. What do we do now? And that's when the sublime comes back with a vengeance. And this is the fourth sublime with the uncanny. And Freud mostly talks about this. And I think it's really interesting because Schopenhauer talked about the will. Freud almost took that to the next level. And the next level is the uncanny, where the will is misaligned. So this marks where the map is no longer. Actually, I should change that. It's where you've covered territory that suddenly is not what it is anymore. So, like, you think you've solved it, you think you have it figured out, but then it's not familiar anymore. And Freud actually says this when he talks about this. He has an essay on the uncanny, and it's when things that are familiar become alien again. And so you end up with a monster like this, with a misaligned reflection or an agentic echo. So it's something that reflects your agency, but something is off about it. It's the other is not very clear, right? If you see a tiger or a snake, it's very clear this is the tiger and this is me, the human being. But when you see reflection of yourself, when you see something that looks like yourself but isn't like yourself, when you're not really sure about the agency of the subject, when you're not sure if it's a predator or a prey, or if it's a prey that's disguising itself as a predator, or if it's a predator disguising itself as prey, that's where I feel like you get the uncanny, where things start to feel fake, things start to feel off, like there's an off key, things start to feel disturbing and creepy and weird. It's not this obvious destruction and power like the ones before. Now it's just weird and transmuted. Um, so again, Freud mostly talked about it, and then Masahiro Mori, he was a Japanese roboticist. He talked about how as robots become more and more human, the more creepy they become. The more they resemble a human face and are able to speak like a human, the more creepy they become. Until at some point, a robot is no longer different from a human, like humans can't tell the difference, which is really interesting. But there is that moment where something is so similar, but it's not. It's, you know how when you're tuning an instrument, like I used to um go to orchestra class in high school, and you can tell like as you're tuning an instrument, when the when you're tuning the A string, for example, and the A string is not exactly an A, it's like a flat A, and it just sounds so bad. It sounds worse than just an off note, because an off note is just a predator. It's just the wrong note. It's like, uh-oh, there's a monster here, we need to run away. The uncanny is when you're playing the A string, but it's flat. So some examples are Freaks of Nature, Dolls, animatronics, Five Nights at Freddy's. That's a really good example of the uncanny. Even my own fursuit head. I think it's pretty cute. Most furries like my fursuit head, but people who aren't used to furries and fursuit heads, when they see this face, they get the uncanny sublime. They get something disturbing because it doesn't look, something feels off about it. It's because it doesn't fully resemble a face or move like a face. Um, so that's the uncanny sublime. The next is the temporal sublime. The temporal deals, so it marks the history and possibilities of the map. So this is the idea that your map can change, and it can change to all kinds of combinations. And also the fact that your map used to be something in the past, and that has baggage to it. Because you're not just this human being who has a map and you just update it. When your map was wrong and you have to update it, that wrongness, you still carry that wrongness with you. So it haunts you. And then of course, there's also the possibility, what is my map going to become into the future? What is going to happen? And that what is going to happen is kind of a monster of its own. It's another limit. Because you're not just marking the limits of predators, predators that you aren't sure are predators or powerful forces. Now you're marking like the limits of even your own understanding of things through time. So this deals with the terror of the past and the future, the limits of time, and if you think about it, if you think about the present moment is the only thing that exists. There is no such thing as the past or the future. And this is where it gets weird, because like we think to ourselves, well, of course there's the past and the future, but like, does anyone act in the past? No, the past is dead. Does anyone act in the future? No, the future hasn't come yet. The past and the future are not real things. The only thing that exists right here, right now, is the present. So the present is kind of haunted or terrorized by the past, by two unknowns. The present is sandwiched by two unknowns. It's also kind of like this idea of what Schopenhauer said, where if you want to know what death is like, it's what life was like before birth. So our existences are kind of sandwiched between these two endless pits of darkness and unknowingness that feel so powerful, even though they just simply don't exist. Before you were alive, there was no existence. After you die, there's no existence. But we act as if these existences exist. And so that's the temporal sublime. And the philosophers that deal with this are Jacques Derrida with his hauntology, Husserl. So, like Derrida took Husserl's idea of time and to its radical end. And then also Stirner, Max Stirner talks about spooks. And the way that I think about spooks is spooks or monsters or like ghosts, right? Because the monsters that the temporal captures are ghosts. Ghosts are these ghosts represent all of the different possibilities that your present moment can become. But the ghosts aren't here yet. Yet they have this very powerful influence. And that's what ghosts are. They're a haunting presence. They're a present that isn't fully there. It's a presence of anti-presence. So ghosts to me are like these fixed identities. They're like these because when we look to the future, we have this ideal fantasy of how we want our life to be. It's like the ultimate end for our life that never actually comes. It's just always hovering above our present. And then we have our past life, things that we want to forget about that keep coming up, that keep impacting the present. And that's what ghosts are. And that's the limits of our understanding of time and like our timeline and how our lives are going to move forward. And so the thing with ghosts is that ghosts appear when we cling too much to an identity, to something that we want to become, something that isn't anymore. If you have a bad relationship to the past and the future, you can have this fear for the future. You can have a fixed identity. You can cling to who you are and you don't want to change. You don't want to adapt to the possibilities because you're going to change, right? The present moment isn't here forever. The future is going to pull you into it, and so you need to kind of ride along with it. So if you don't have a good relationship, um, you can kind of repeat yourself. You can have compulsive repetition compulsion. And then on the positive side, if you have a really good relationship to ghosts of the future and the past, you can almost have foresight and hindsight. You can prepare for the future. You can start making decisions and actions that will benefit you in the future to come, and you can use what happened to you in the past to make better decisions now. So that which is foresight and hindsight. And so a really good example for the temporal sublime is the dead marshes. It's just the perfect example. I think I'm just gonna do a video on this, the dead marshes. Because in Lord of the Rings, a lot of people don't know what the dead marshes are, but they're literally these ghosts that are haunting the present because of all of the horrible past battles, all of the history of battles that were fought on these marshlands. They're represented as ghosts that are haunting the present and that baggage that the present has to carry, this sense of like, look at all of this horrible stuff that has happened in the past, and we have to carry it going on into the future. The next sublime is the indifferent. So some people might say that the indifferent is just taking the mathematical sublime to a higher level, and I think that's true to some degree, but the indifferent is it's much more powerful than that because and this is what Lovecraft is all about. This is what the Call of Cthulhu and all of that. It's the terror of insignificance of insignificance. So this is where the limits of the sublime itself become sublime. It's kind of like monsters to the second power. It's kind of like it's when your own limits have limits, if that makes any sense. So we're marking all of the edges of our map, all of the limits of our map. The indifferent sublime is saying that there's a limit to the limits of your own map making limits, if you can wrap your head around that. So, like, you think that the predator that you're facing against, like the tiger, or like your concept of past and future, you think those are really powerful, meaningful limits and they're very sublime, right? And you can have rational dignities. The indifferent sublime is kind of saying that your limit of past and future, for example, is already like, it's not even, that's already limited. There are limits that you haven't even discovered yet. There are limits that make your limits seem normal and mundane. That's what the indifferent sublime is about. So, uh, And this is why I said it marks meaningless on your map. It's kind of recognizing like your map doesn't really matter. Your categories for things don't really matter. And this is why it has to do with space and alien intelligence and things beyond you, because aliens know things that you can't even comprehend that you don't know them. So it's making the vastness of space so vast that it makes the vastness of space insignificant, if that makes any sense. I mean, it's hard to think about, but it definitely deserves its own unique um spot. And again, it just deals with the monsters are Cthulhu, aliens, Space Godzilla. Space Godzilla is still relatable, but I guess what I really want to drive home with these monsters is that these monsters, when you project a face onto them, the face does not stare back at you. That's the main thing. The, because for all of monsters, they give us meaning and purpose. Again, it goes back to the predatory sublime. I'm a consciousness, I'm an agentic being, I'm looking for other agentic beings. But when you come across something so big and so alien and project a face onto it, the face does not stare back at you. The face just looks past you. And that's what's terrifying about this monster is that the monster doesn't care about you. The monster doesn't give you meaning. The monster doesn't fight back. The monster doesn't um, criticize you. The monster doesn't try to judge you, or it just goes about whatever it's doing. You're almost like an ant to the monster. That's what makes it so terrifying. And so the rational dignity is calm acceptance and peace in the sense that, like, wow, I'm so small and insignificant that it doesn't matter what I do because I'm so powerless and like it doesn't matter, which really helps with I mean it calms your anxiety and worry about the world in the sense like I'm not going to change anything. No one cares what I do, so I can kind of relax and just go about my life. So it's very calm and peaceful in that sense. But it can also give rise to madness, nihilism, and despair because a lot of people can't accept that their minds are so insignificant that their own understanding of reality is so small that it just drives them nuts because they feel like, well, I need to know things. Or I guess you could say, if you really want to know the universe as it is, you kind of have to go mad in order to know it. If you want to have alien intelligence, if you want to think like an alien, you need to risk going mad. So that's the alien indifferent sublime. The next sublime is the abject sublime. This deals with horror and shock, and it marks tears and stains on the map. I guess you could say it's marking where the map is falling apart or in decay. Because if we think about the map is just a symbol or a representation of of your own mind and your own existence figuring stuff out. But the abject sublime shows you that the map is kind of part of the territory already. That there's a there's a boundary break between this stuff. That your map is not completely separate from the territory. Like your map tears, your map falls apart, your map loses its symbols, right? There's a sense of decay and decomposition. That's the terror, decay and decomposition. And so you lose your identity, you lose your boundaries. The things that you marked on the map, all of the different names and all of the symbols, that can kind of fall apart and fall away. And that's pretty terrifying. The philosopher who deals with this is Christiva, which is pretty interesting. She talks about the philosophy of horror, which is really powerful. And it's usually what people think about with monsters. You could think about the abject sublime. It's in between subject and object. If you think about the subject, it's kind of like the target. If you think about the object, which is you, the abject is kind of like that in between zone. And so this is why it's like a zombie. Like the monsters for this are zombies, skeletons, ghouls, infestations, parasites, things eating you, your skin starts to fall apart and break apart. That's the monster. It's like these zombies, these disease zombies that are going to pass on their disease and their fluids and their blood and gore. And so like I always think of Final Destination. I think of just like horror, gore, slop, literally slop. It's like sloppy, gross. Um, I mean, it's very. This is like if you want to know like which monsters are horrific and shocking, it would be the abject sublime. So in a weird way, it's I almost feel like it's the least interesting sublime, but it's also the most terrifying because I was gonna say this, but I forgot. But the abject sublime is like the extension of the predatory sublime. The predatory sublime is scary because it could eat you, but what's beneath the predatory sublime? The elimination of the consciousness. So, like, the predatory sublime is the terror of recognizing that you're conscious. The abject sublime is the terror of recognizing that your consciousness could go away and it can decay and fall apart. It's the logical conclusion when a predator gets you and starts eating you. Um, and of course, there's rational dignity and rational failure. The rational dignity is clearer boundary formation. So you really understand diseases and how they work and when you're actually infected and when you're not infected and how to like your understanding of boundaries is far more fluid and balanced rather than these very rigid boundaries that you construct around yourself. Because, right, if you're terrified of getting a disease or if you see a zombie, which, there's no such thing as zombies, but again, monsters' faces are used to mark the limit of something. Zombies are used to right? They're the monstrous face of diseased people. And so if you see a zombie, you fall into obsessive purity, contamination panic, lots of what happened during the COVID days in 2020 and 2021, right? Hatred of the body. There's um and it's really interesting too. Um like anyway, actually I'll talk about that later. Um the next one is the systemic and abstract sublime. So the systemic and abstract sublime is a very tricky one, and it's kind of like the indifferent sublime. So while the predatory sublime is the monstrous face, like a tiger or a snake, and the indifferent sublime looks past you, the systemic and abstract sublime doesn't have a face. So what makes this one so terrifying is the fact that there is no face that you can put onto it. So this is if you think about the system, right? The terror is complexity and displacement. It's when your system's abstractions and simple symbol manipulation become far too complex to understand. That's when you experience the systemic sublime and the map marks you. It's almost as if your own constructions, your own creations take on a life of their own. And when they take on a life of your own, you can't pinpoint the face or the agency of it. You can't figure out where it's going and where it's heading. So examples of this are like our capitalist system today, our huge giant system of capitalism all over the world, right? Just the economic system, political systems, artificial intelligence, bureaucratic systems, papers, documents, um, IDs, like all of these numbers, all of these titles, all of these papers, all of these transactions, all of this stuff that create the system is so complex and it's so detailed and it's so specialized with all of its sectors that no one really understands what the system is doing. No one has full control over the system. And this is why, and this is so sorry, but there's a lot of this is whys. This is why there's a lot of philosophers who talk about this, like Hannah Arendt and Foucault and Nick Land and Baudrillard and Debord, right? Lots of postmodernist philosophers. Hannah Arendt, when she talked about Eichmann, Michel Foucault and his understanding of power relations and the subject produces knowledge. Um, Nick Land, where Nick Land and his book Fanged Noumena and his blog, where he talks about how capitalism is accelerating, and it's accelerating in this way that is too fast to be comprehended by any human being. It's almost like it has an agency of its own. So, like, I like to represent the systemic sublime with a hand because it's our own making. We created the system. We created all of these economic transactions. And what happened is they took on a life of their own. And this is why you get a lot of conspiracy minded thinking, not only because of the predatory sublime, but when we start to perceive a threat, when something is becoming too powerful, in the same way that oceans and volcanoes and storms were too powerful for ancient people and they created gods to capture that, what is happening today? The same thing is happening again. We're putting a monstrous face onto the system. With this is what conspiracy theorists are doing. They're trying to, right, so they're like blaming the Jews, or they're blaming rich people, or they blame actual, they're trying to, like with the Epstein files with Jeffrey Epstein, they're trying to, like, you know, oh, there must be something in the Epstein files. It was, Jeffrey Epstein was controlling everything, and there's a lot of mystery and secrecy around what Jeffrey Epstein was actually doing. Like, how did he acquire all of that money? People really want these Epstein files to kind of show how, like, the system is being run by these terrible people, but at the bottom of it, no one is really in control. And so anyway, so you have human faces that are projected onto the system as a whole. And I'm not saying like these humans are good people and that they shouldn't be blamed. They should be. Jeffrey Epstein should go to jail. He deserved, the ending of his life. And like Eichmann, he was totally responsible for what he did. But the point is, the system is so powerful and it's so big to comprehend that it's not just about these bad people anymore. Anyway, this is for a whole separate video. I'm getting way off. The best monster to capture this is Frankenstein's monster, because Frankenstein's monster was pieced together. He was a conglomeration of all these dead body parts, just like all of these different sectors of the economy and all of these different sciences. They're all put together into kind of the system. And then Frankenstein's monster suddenly comes alive. And the creator, with his own hands, he created this monster with his own hands. This monster comes alive, and he's terrified of it, and he runs away. So Frankenstein's monster is a really good example. The Invisible Hand is a classic example. I mean, Adam Smith came up with the Invisible Hand as a kind of symbol or just a way to better understand how the free market works. But the invisible hand is actually creepy. Like, imagine a giant spiritual hand, manipulating things. Like, it sounds like he's trying to use a predatory face to explain the market. And when you do that, it just sounds creepy and dark. Like you're being manipulated and controlled behind the scenes, but it's not a face, it's just a hand, and it just makes you wonder if is there a face that's controlling the hand. But there isn't. It's just our own hands. We created the system, and the system is just rebelling against us. Like, I don't know, it's just gotten so big and so powerful that we've lost control over it. And so, like, this is a perfect example of the Tower of Babel moment. Like, we're experiencing the Tower of Babel right now. um So yeah, I'm gonna make videos on all of these different sublimes, and there's so much to talk about with the systemic sublime. It's like it is the most philosophically dense, but yeah, we have to move on, unfortunately. I guess the last thing I'll say, the rational dignity is feeling your own body and your own emotions, because when you're dealing with all this complex and abstract stuff and all these models, it's important to realize that these are just symbols. These this has nothing to do with actual reality. And so this sublime teaches you, this is why the map literally marks you. When it becomes so monstrous, you become aware of your own body and your own feelings. But if you fail with this, you see a lot of what's happening today with objectification. Everyone is objectified, everyone is a number. Everything is based on utility and maximizing utility and optimization. Everyone is hollow, dissociated, withdrawed, depressed. The systemic sublime is the big one. It is the big limitation of our consciousness right now that we're dealing with. This is the big monster that we can't face because there is no face for it. And so modern humans are really struggling with this one. And then lastly, we have the transgressive sublime. And what's really interesting about this one is that it marks the forbidden territories of the map. So all of the other sublimes were literally limitations of our own epistemology. Like, it was epistemological. The limitations were literally of our own cognition and our own rationality. The transgressive is the limitation of the map itself, and in the sense that the territory is already marked and understood, but you still can't explore this territory. Why? Because it's unethical and immoral. And so the transgressive is kind of like an ethical sublime. It's about crossing the limits. It's about coming up against the limit of things that you're not supposed to do, like things that are taboo, things that are immoral, things that are wrong. The monsters that represent the transgressive sublime are your typical evil people. A lot of the time, these monsters are just evil human beings. They're given a monstrous face. They're mythologized. They're made more evil than they actually are. They're just human beings that did bad stuff. But in movies and shows, they're treated as though they're actual predatory monsters. And so, I mean, classic examples are like Darth Vader and Lord Voldemort and Sauron. They're very stylish. A lot of the time, I don't know why, a lot of these villains they're all dressed in black and they're stylish and they're dehumanized. Like Lord Voldemort looks like a robot. I mean, Darth Vader looks like a robot almost with his mask. Lord Voldemort looks almost like a snake with his nose coming off, and he has this very pale skin. He almost looks like an alien. And then we have Lord Sauron and Lord of the Rings, where he's dressed in a giant suit of spiky armor. He's been totally dehumanized in the process. He doesn't resemble a human at all. He represents like this anti-human. So the transgressive is about marking the boundaries of the map that are already known, but you're not allowed to explore them. And so it just deals with taboos and evil. Like, it's and again, morals are subjective, and I'm not trying to say like it's okay to rape and murder people. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying like morals are fluid. They change over time. There's a history behind them. So like homosexuality, for example, used to be very immoral in the past. Nowadays, it's not really that immoral. It's actually celebrated. Murder is a very interesting one. Murder is evil, generally speaking, but in self-defense, it's good. To keep society safe with capital punishment, it's good. So a lot of this stuff, again, it's not the limits of our knowledge. It's not epistemological. It's ethical. It's the sublime of the ethical. And this is why you get a lot of people with like comedians and right, because comedians cross boundaries without really crossing them. They almost like walk up to the line and then they back away. And that's what humor is. And it's very different. So like if you contrast this, um, because the main philosopher you have for this one is Marquis de Sade. And then Marquis de Sade is like the opposite of Immanuel Kant, who was the guy who came up with the first two sublimes. So Kant And his sublimes are very much about spiritually elevating yourself, like getting closer to God in a sense. Like when you look at the beauty of a mountain and when you experience the grandness of nature, its power elevates you. While if you're at the transgressive sublime with Marquis de Sade, it's not about elevating yourself towards God. It's about exploration. It's not about crossing the limits with God. It's about crossing the limits of human beings. And so Marquis de Sade takes a horizontal position. So Kant wants to go up. He's vertical. He wants to elevate. Marquis de Sade says, forget that. Forget about the limits of the mountain. What are the limits of human beings? And so he takes a more horizontal direction. Um, and so some really good examples of this are, I already said, like Darth Vader, but also Cenobites and clowns. So clowns are really good at with humor, right? They explore the limits of humor, and it's kind of interesting. Like a lot of people are afraid of clowns. Why is it? I think it's because clowns are intimately tied with the transgressive sublime. There's something dark and sadistic about humor. Um, and like the Joker is a really popular villain these days, and he's like a clown. Um, but the Cenobites are really interesting in the sense that they're not evil like Darth Vader, but they're not clownish. Um, and but they're about the experience. So they're not crossing human boundaries to be deliberately immoral. They're crossing them to experience sensations. It gets complicated. I'm gonna make videos for all of these, but you can definitely feel like there's two different types of villains for the transgressive that I need to explain much better. So that's it for the nine sublimes. The anti-sublime is politics. So this marks people and territory on the map. So it's about fighting over territory. So this is really interesting because everything we've been talking about, it's about expanding our map. It's about standing at the edge of our map making. Politics is about how are we going to divide the boundaries? Who gets the power? Who gets to decide where we get to go? Who decides where we can't go? So the politics to me is very anti-sublime. It's very negative because you lose contact with God. You lose contact with the great unknown. You're not spiritually elevated or rationally dignified anymore. You're not pushed to the limit of your ability to understand the world. Politics shrinks your mind. It makes you small. And in many ways, the monsters of politics are human beings, which is kind of funny. Like, you would never think, what, human beings are monsters? Yes, they can very much become monsters. When we stop facing the monsters outside of us, when we stop paying attention to the limits of our own consciousness, we start becoming monsters ourselves. We shrink our world so much that fellow human beings, natural um relationships that are cooperative and make our lives better suddenly become monstrous and demonic. And this is why in politics people demonize each other all the time and they scapegoat and they have tribes and there's political streamers and they're either Democrat or Republican and it's just a bunch of fighting and a bunch of yelling, right? When you demonize a person, when you call someone names and when you make them look stupid and it's about winning and having the better team, you're creating divide and conquer dynamics. You're demonizing the other side. You're literally creating a monster out of the other side. And so the limit of your imagination is so small and so puny that you become a monster yourself and other people demonize you. And so politics to me is just this very crude form of sublimity. It's so crude that I don't know if crude is the right word, but it's just so it's not about focusing on the monsters outward. It's about making monsters within the map itself. Territories that you've already discovered, you're creating monsters out of these territories unnecessarily. And this is what terrorism is. This is what virtue signaling is. I mean, I'll talk about this later, but monsters, right? What are monsters? They're faces of terror. Monsters are they're signs and they're signals. Different faces signal different things. But in politics, the faces are the monstrous faces are artificial or weaponized. So terror is induced in people artificially. Terror is forced upon people. And so we lose the sublime because the sublime is about slowly coming up to your limit of knowledge and being able to face it. But in politics, it's just shoved in your face on purpose to make you fearful and afraid so that you can be controlled and manipulated. That's it for the nine sublimes and the anti-sublime. I wanted to add more in this video, but I'm just not going to be able to talk about it, unfortunately. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for watching. Bye.